I'm not even sure how much ground we have to cover, but there's lots of ground to cover, and I'm sure we're not going to cover it in the next little more than an hour. But I think Jarrett mentioned there are a couple anniversaries that we could perhaps acknowledge, not necessarily celebrate, but acknowledge. One was something like 150 years ago, and everybody knows what that is. There's one that's 5 years ago, and not all of us are so ready to acknowledge it, because it's not that it didn't enter our radar screens, but it's something that wasn't necessarily central to certainly my being, and maybe it should have been. And that was a movement 5 years ago, Idle No More. I'd like to talk for a bit about that, and these are all people who were very much involved in it. I guess my first question is, where did it come from, and what was it 5 years ago? What was happening? Jared, you were the first person to talk about it, so maybe you should begin the conversation.
Well, I mean, I think even Alex was closer to the ground on that than me, so I will defer to her.
Alex.
Sure, yeah. Well, Idle No More started, Idle No More is a continuation of something that started 150 years ago. So it's the current contemporary iteration of a long-standing movement of Indigenous people standing up and saying that, stating that this is our land, and there are certain rights that go along with that and responsibilities. But 5 years ago, the current movement started because of the increasingly devastational governmental policies that were being proposed at the time and subsequently went through, that continually eroded Indigenous people's rights and also eroded the protection of land and water. And so there were 4 women in Saskatchewan that got together and started working together around doing teach-ins, around educating around the bills that were being proposed. And that eventually kind of led to more people, and eventually became not just a national movement, but an international movement that united Indigenous folks and allies as well around the rights of Indigenous peoples, but also the protection of land and water. And so it's changed over the years, but still going. The form of Idle No More today doesn't get as much press, but people are still working just as hard on the similar issues. And people may not call themselves a part of Idle No More, but that's okay too, because we're all still doing the important work that we need to do.
Alex, briefly, just what was your involvement 5 years ago? What were you doing?
What was I doing?
Yeah.
I was part of the communications team, and I still am. And so that is the educational component. So a lot of us who were involved in the movement really understood the importance of framing things in terms of educating each other, but also the larger world. So that's in the form of teach-ins and educational campaigns, but also on-the-ground land defense as well.
Leanne, you were involved then too. What was your involvement, and where do you think the movement was coming from and going to?
Well, I think for me, things go back farther than 150 years, because in this part of Canada, and in the Anishinaabeg Nation, we've been engaged in over 400 years of resistance. And so I remember when I was probably 16, sitting in this theater watching Twelfth Night, I think, in my grade 10 English class. And the idea that we would have an elder from Kettle and Stony Point on the stage speaking in Anishinaabe is something that wouldn't have crossed my mind. It would have seemed impossible in the 1980s. And so I think that for me, I have to look at Idle No More and things like the resistance at Kanesatake or the Oka crisis in the context of this 400 years. And there's a tremendous love of the land that I think that we heard from Elizabeth. There's a tremendous love of our people and our families and our cultures. And Indigenous people have had to fight very, very hard over the last 400 years to survive physically and to have a relationship to our homelands. And so a lot of this resistance, I think, isn't visible to Canadians because until Idle No More, we weren't very visible to Canadians. There's part of Canadian culture that sort of erases that until we have these flashpoint events. But I think it's, in a sense, it's a miracle that we're here today, that we're speaking our languages, that we are still attached and in love with our land, and that we want a different future for our children. So I sort of see my life's work fitting into that 400 years of resistance as a responsibility that I have to my community and to my nation and to the land.
Jarrett.
Yeah, I don't know more made me think a lot about temporality, which both Alex and Leanne have been speaking to, in particular because my initial point of discovery for the movement was through Twitter. And it was, yeah, shout out to Twitter. Also because it was the first time for me that I'd seen the really collective, active engagement of the Indigenous community in a shared way, like in a focused way online. And at the time, that kind of idea of us organizing, as it were, around a hashtag, which now feels like a completely sort of redundant move, but like 5 years ago felt like it was a real opportunity. And it was like, oh, hey, we can be part of this conversation together and so on. And I was kind of struck by particularly a whole new generation of younger people who found one another through the internet and new relationships that I'll say, even for my part, that have been formed and now continued, that whose genesis point, like whose sort of original connection happened through these online connections. And that was a new thing for me. So its newness, I think, was also part of its problem in a certain sense, which is what Leanne's alluding to, I think, in the sense that we are inheriting these hundreds of years of resistance that coalesced into this moment where there was so much engagement and online activity that was flowing back to land-based defense and so on. And I was really impressed by that and was kind of contributing to help spread the word and get media attention on different things that were happening as much as possible from the small vantage point of my own corner of Turtle Island, where I was watching this unfold and being involved in the local movement that was happening on the West Coast at the time where I was. And at the same time, that temporality, I think, was something that I was realizing, and that as much as we had this investment in the opportunity provided by something like Twitter or pick your social media platform, that this idea of the kind of momentary attention on the thing that's gaining headlines when it never has before has this incredible affective, emotional kind of feeling and power that you're like, okay, we're an unstoppable force now, and we're gathering our strength, and we have all this momentum. And the very technology that helps for that distribution of the messaging itself can become the thing that can hinder some of the longer term movement building because you get invested in this idea. And I think, for those of you that were following or paid attention to another huge movement that happened over the last year plus at Standing Rock, is another example of that, where it took a long time for people to pay attention to what was happening there. There had been long-standing resistance to these larger projects, and then the very spotlight that's turned on the issues feels like it has a tremendous power to transform something for the longer term, and yet you realize how quickly that same narrative can turn back in on itself or turn back against you. So I think part of the continuity that we're talking about in terms of the resistance movements that have been happening across this continent for hundreds and hundreds of years is testament to the fact that the fundamental questions that these movements are responding to have not been addressed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have again and again and again the recurrence. So I Don't Know More is one, Ganasataga is one, and Standing Rock is one, and their recurrence marks that. It marks the fact of the persistence of these underlying systemic level problems that can't be addressed with that level of temporality. They're not fleeting surface level issues that we're talking about here. We're talking about very deep relationships to the actual land that supports the life that we live on, the actual water that supports all of our lives. And so until we really get right with those issues, we're going to kind of continue to see those things. And so I thought a lot about, in my own life, thinking about what it means to organize in relationship to these kinds of movements, what it means to invest in those temporalities, because while they feel good and they feel empowering at a certain level, they can also lead you astray because the spotlight shifts and the movements continue, and the pace of our own attention is so constantly being usurped by the next thing and the next thing and the next thing that it becomes very difficult to think in longer term ways and to act in longer term ways. And that very approach is the approach that, at least in my own learning and experience from my elders, is what is called for. It's not about the fleeting temporality that I'm describing. It's about thinking much, much further ahead.
I have a feeling we could spend the next 5 years talking about what you've just talked about. And not just the next 5, maybe 150 or 400. I mean, that's really sort of the crux of exactly what I want to talk about today, and I think that we need to talk about. I mean, what about that temporality? What do you do with that temporality? And you started, so I'm not going to throw the ball back at you again, Jarrett, but what about the fact that that was something that everyone in the room knows about, and yet we've all sort of conveniently forgotten about it, or let it slip away, or just not be concerned because, oh, we dealt with it. That was 5 years ago. Things are fixed. What do you think, all of three of you, about that?
I think it depends who you mean by we, because
Okay.
I think Indigenous people certainly haven't forgotten about that. And sort of one of I've often talked about the Oka crisis as being the first and the biggest political education of my life, and watching that unfold on the CBC over the summer of 1990 when I was about 18 or 19 was certainly something that set me off on this path. And I think the second big event in that political education of me as an Anishinaabe student was the Ipperwash crisis and the loss of Dudley George. And so that's something that has a lot of resonance for me coming to this part of Anishinaabe territory, because that was a very clear demonstration of a community coming together and standing up for their land and for the quality of their land and for having that relationship that I was talking about. And so I think looking at this from an Anishinaabe perspective, we don't sort of in our way of thinking have this past, present, and future, this linear time. Right now, my elders would teach me that we have this present moment, and that present moment is the past and the future collapsing in on itself. So my ancestors are not something that's in the past. They're right here with me. My elders are right here with me. My great-grandchildren, who are theoretical, are right here. And so I have to be thinking about, when I'm conducting myself in the world, I have to be thinking about all of these relations, in my relationships to that lake, in my relationships to the people that have stood up and protected things. So for a lot of times, I think that Canadians think of colonialism and dispossession and genocide as a historic event that took place in the past. And I think for Indigenous people, these are structures that we live with and we live through every day. And so I think the crux of my life is to try to figure out how to stay connected and how to stay grounded and how to find those little rays of light and freedom, so that I can start to exist in those spaces and rebuild the Anishinaabe Nation from the inside out, not according to the values and the political processes and the policies of Canada, but according to the intellectual practices and the concepts that are encoded in our language and the way that our elders live. So I think for me, that's been important to center that in my life, rather than sort of reacting to whatever's going on Twitter.
Twitter's probably listening to this while you said that, by the way.
Alex.
Yeah, I think just going on that relationality is really important, and not just relationships between people, but relationships to everything, everything that's alive, but also relationships to theory. And so when Leanne talks about her relationships to the next generations, there's an accountability that comes with that. I think there has been definitely a level of knowing and not knowing with Canada. And the not knowing is either by design or unintentional, but I think mostly by design. And again, because I'm in the field of education, I think education is really responsible for a big part of that. So why is it that Canadians do not know the reality, our reality, or even the history or the contemporary context of Indigenous folks? And so I think you all know on some level, but there's a degree of dissociation happening as well, because when you know on a visceral level what's happened, you have to do something about it. So pretending not to know is kind of keeping everybody complacent, I would say.
Jarrett?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenge, the educational part is such a huge challenge, because while Alex was talking, I was thinking about that, yeah, that responsibility on the part of non-Indigenous people to learn the history of what's happened in the places where we all live, the territories where we all reside, whatever our relationship to that territory is, like wherever we've arrived from in being there. And then I was thinking also so much about the most recent time that I've spent with my elders back home, and the urgency that they've communicated about the learning that we need to do of our own ways in our own home territory. And it sort of follows from what Leanne was saying, that we could spend our lives kind of only engaging and responding to all of the various demands that are coming from settler society. And at a certain level, depending on what that imposition is, we have to. So there's certain things that we have to respond to. But at the same time, if we're not putting that same energy or equal energy, and I would even argue more than on balance, like more energy back into our own systems of knowledge and our own ways of knowing and learning and ceremony and so on, which is something that, like in my own life, given the other demands of the work that I do and the fact that I live in Toronto and so on, are something that I struggle with in my own life, to try to manifest these things and try to make time for them and prioritize them in a way that I realize how easily our lives can kind of be eclipsed by the banality of the day-to-day of the other expectations that are put on us, and that applies to non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people as well. And that in the case of some of the elders that I have spent time with and that I'm privileged enough to learn from and to be able to spend time learning from, that communication of urgency is something that I don't take lightly, in the sense that we're losing a lot of our old people, we're losing a lot of people who are the carriers of this knowledge, and if us as the younger generations are not taking up that responsibility and making the time for that, which comes at the expense of spending time engaged in other ways, then this whole question of what continues and how we continue to rebuild a different kind of present becomes really threatened. So I think that navigating that and negotiating what that looks like is obviously something that is a responsibility for each of us in terms of how we take that up. But it's, the old people I spend time with are not letting me forget about that. They're like, make sure you make time. Make sure you make time.
I guess I want to ask the question that's sort of what you were just talking about, is that where has it gone, say, in 5 years? So if we can all acknowledge, and I agree the date means nothing, all dates mean nothing because all dates are everything or something, but what's happened in 5 years? Has anything happened? Has there been an improvement? And I'll speak about the Indigenous community first. Do you think that the Indigenous community has galvanized in a way that it wasn't galvanized 5 years ago, or before Oka, or before Ipperwash, or before 1885, or before 1876, or before 1492? I mean, pick the date, whatever it is. But what has there been an improvement? I guess initially within the last 5 years. But do you see progress here? Do you see a movement towards a better world?
I think everyone wants the answer to be yes.
Yeah.
But I think the reality is that the environment is in worse shape, that Indigenous peoples in Canada have less land and less access to land, and that in terms of the political landscape, very little has changed other than sort of the superficial window dressing and language around new relationships. And so I think that a lot hasn't changed. And I think there's also a cost to Indigenous communities in terms of emotional capital and energy in launching such a large movement. So there's often a period of recovery. But I think that the Indigenous community has learned a lot. I think that our energies are focused back in doing the work that we've always been doing, and making connections not just within our own nations, but with other movements like Black Lives Matters, who are doing some incredible work in our territories as well.
Alex?
Yeah, I think some things have changed and other things have maybe gone a few steps back. But just in general, it's kind of exciting. Like, for example, last week I was in northern BC in Alert Bay, and they've got a land defense going there around open net fish farming, and they've had that for about 30 years. The community there not wanting open net fish farming because it's just damaging the indigenous salmon there, and that's impacting the environment, it's impacting the people. But going there and talking to people there, and to see how excited they are about Idle No More, I think that's the spark that's still there. And no matter where I go in Canada, people know about Idle No More. And so it at least raised some kind of a hopeful energy. And it united people in a way, I think, that hadn't happened. Well, it wasn't possible before because, partially because of the social media. It was the first time that a modern day social movement was predominantly led by women and queer people, which is, I think, very significant. And I think that that's still happening with the Idle No More movement. It's predominantly women and queer people that are behind the scenes, doing the Idle No More work. At any time of the day, there's somebody doing that work for the larger movement, whether it's here or in Hawaii or wherever. So I don't think that would have been possible 5 years ago, or it didn't happen 5 years ago. And then I think just, talking to kids in communities across Canada, across North America especially, they're very literate around issues like the bills. And I don't think that would have happened prior to Idle No More. But you talk to a 10-year-old and they can tell you what Bill C-45 was and what Bill C-38 was. And not only that they actually read them. And when I was a teenager, there's no way in the world I would have read a 400-page bill, right? But so it sparked that kind of intellectual interest in connecting, the different parts of who we are to land protection, and kind of like others have said, that the urgency to do so, and that urgency is still very, very evident.
All three of you are very much involved in education, and you've all mentioned education as something that is essential to move forward. And education, I think, is double-faced. I mean, you have to educate within the Indigenous world, and you have to also educate us white guys about what's going on and what needs to go on, and what we need to know, even. I'd love to hear all of you talk about education, what you do in education, how you imagine education, what it is, and what you hope it will do. Jared, start with you.
Well, I mean, of my two friends and colleagues who are here, I've probably worked the least directly in terms of education in my work, and yet in the context of particularly my work with the Indigenous arts community, Indigenous music community, I feel like I've been very interested in the idea that the creative work that's being made in our community, and the wide array of diverse, incredible artistic work that's being made in this country by the Indigenous community and Indigenous artists, is something that does the work of education, not maybe even under that banner. And in that respect, and I think it's partly why, even having done my graduate studies and so on, and having a relationship still to the world of education and the academy, albeit a more peripheral one at the moment, I think one of the reasons why my work has really shifted in terms of a focus on arts and music and so on is because I feel like it's a much less, and not to say that education is always this in other contexts, but it's not a didactic way of coming at the problem. There's a way in which art and music kind of provides an entry point for people that they might not otherwise experience in another context, or that they might have a point of discovery through the arts that might come to them in a context that they wouldn't otherwise expect. And through that experience, at an experiential level, there's a possibility for a different kind of discovery that can lead to maybe even the self-education work on the part of that person to go on and think through more of whatever that they saw a theater piece that inspired them, and they went and did their own research about maybe some of the issues that were raised in that, or they heard music or what have you. And so I see on the part of that as a framing for a way of learning something that's really critical and of importance in that respect. And then the other that I think that, I mean, there's many aspects that I could talk about this, both in relationship to my own life and practice, but then in the context of some of the wider work that I've been trying to do. The other one that I think I've seen in a really beautiful way that's just been an emergent practice on the part of a lot of the younger artists that I work with has been that younger Indigenous artists are very interested in what's gone before, and they're increasingly taking up the opportunity to learn about those artists who kind of have laid some of the groundwork for the things that they now inherit in their music or in their visual artwork or whatever it is. And so there's a kind of a organic level of education that's happening within the arts community that is about that kind of discovery happening with and across disciplines and genres of practice and within and across different communities. And I think that that work is also very important as well, because it recuperates some of the history that we're talking about in a way that doesn't separate the past and present. And actually, it brings some of these things together in ways that I think are important learning for our own people as well, to think that, or to learn about, for example, that there was an artist collective that was doing the same thing that you were doing 50 years ago, and as you discover that, you're like, okay, yeah, we're not starting from nothing with these things. There's been a lot of work that's gone into these things from before that we can draw strength from, and then there's an importance in being able to have that strength in the current struggles, because the struggles haven't changed. So understanding that we are part of this, of a continuum of struggle and a continuum of resistance that follows through in these different ways, provides an opportunity for us to learn about that, and then to do something with the knowledge that we've gained from that learning.
What's fascinating to me is that the way in that answer you've defined education is that almost that education is everything, but it's also education is me. And you've gone through your own education, you've educated yourself, you've been educated by elders, and that's how you sort of deem the world of education to be defined. I mean, it is something you've learned through your own process of living, and then it's something that you feel you have to share, and that the necessity of sharing it is something that's crucial. Leanne, I think that from what little I know about you, that's sort of how you live your life.
Well, I have a PhD as well, and my experience of the university was one where I sort of was butting heads, I guess, with the anti-intellectualism of the university in terms of recognizing different bodies of knowledge. And so there's some parts in the Canadian education system, whether you're talking about the public education system or the university system, there's some big chunks of knowledge and practices of generating knowledge that are missing. So the knowledge of Indigenous people is one of those bodies of knowledge, but I would also say the knowledge of the Black community in Canada is also, for the most part, not part of our university system. So for me, after I had a really wonderful experience in my early 20s where I was working with a group of elders in Long Lake 58 First Nation in Northern Ontario, and we were doing a land use mapping project, and they were taking me out as a young Anishinaabe person, and they were teaching me the different place names for all the different places in their territory. They were showing me where they did all of their traditional activities, and I was marking them on the map. And over the course of that 2 years, I recognized this Anishinaabe brilliance that I hadn't ever come in contact with in the school system, this way of thinking that was complex, and theoretical, a way of constructing the world that was much different than the way that I had been brought up. And that sort of caught my attention. And so after I finished my PhD, I moved back home into my territory, and I developed a relationship with Doug Williams, who's an elder from Curve Lake, over the last 2 decades, because I wanted to be able to think like those elders, and not just think like those elders, but live like those elders. And so that took me on a journey really outside of the academy and outside of what a successful academic career would look like, because to really be able to embody our knowledge, you have to live it, and our elders, people like Elizabeth, have been doing this for 6 or 7 generations. It involved language learning. It involved learning how to hunt. Involved learning how to fish and make maple sugar and collect wild rice. And it really involved falling in love with the land and centering that. So that sort of became the spine of my artistic practice as a writer and as a musician, and also as my intellectual practice. And that's something that for me didn't fit in and wasn't acknowledged or seen within the university system. Now, sort of after doing that work for the last 20 or so years, I'm faculty at the Dutchinsa Center for Research and Learning in the Yellowknives Dene territory of Denendeh in the Northwest Territories. And we are trying to develop a bush university or a land-based university where we take Dene students and Dene elders out onto the land for 6 weeks at a time. And they learn directly from those elders on the land, and they are also exposed to people like me who can teach them about the Indian Act and colonization and colonialism. And it's a really, really wonderful experience for me to be able to connect Dene students with Dene elders and sort of almost get out of the way, just to sort of create that space on the land and get out of the way. So I think, we talk a lot about education because there's such a disparity in terms of funding for First Nations students and non-Indigenous students, but I think we have to think very carefully about what kind of education. Because I see a bit of an urgency right now. Although we're producing lots of Indigenous people with PhDs, that doesn't mean that you can think with inside your culture. That doesn't mean we're producing lots of Elizabeths. And so I think that our communities have to think really carefully and do the things that we have to do in order to give our children this tremendous connection with their ancestors and therefore with their future.
I'm curious about was there one thing or was there one realization that you came to when you were out after your Western traditional education, when you went out onto the land and were learning other things? What was it that convinced you that there was a lot missing in the former world? What was there an experience on the land? Was there an experience with other people that led you to believe that there were gaps in that former knowledge?
Oh, I think any Indigenous student at a post-secondary educational institute in Canada already has that feeling. You already know what's missing. And so often our students have negative experiences at university because our experts and our knowledge holders and our cultures are not there, and if they're there, they're not presented in a truthful and an honorable light. So I think for me, I was already by the time I arrived back in the arms of those elders and on the land, I was well aware of what was missing in that Western system. I think as I spent more time with them on the land, what was undone in me was this thing that I had been taught, that my people were not smart, that they were not technologically advanced, that they didn't have theory, that they didn't have methodology. And as I worked with these elders and I observed them and I learned from them, I think what blew my mind was the brilliance, was the intelligence, was the Anishinaabe intelligence. And not just in terms of intellect, but on a physical plane, a spiritual plane, and an emotional plane. And that to me represented not just feeling whole and connected, but it showed me that there was another world that was operating alongside this colonized world that was heaping so much violence on me as this Indigenous student. And so it was, in a way, it was like a refuge. And I thought, I want to live in this world that they've created, because I feel so grounded. And watching them create this world was such a beautiful gift. And I think even if I look back at my mom's generation, and going back each generation, those families got up and they made everything. They made their food, they made their shelter, they made their political system, they made their religion, they made their language, they made their clothes. There was a continual process of creation that was the fabric of life. And it would be very easy for me to get up every day and not make anything, just buy things, right? And so
Wrapped in plastic.
Wrapped in plastic. And so I think that for me, that's a really powerful way as an artist and an intellect to live within that sort of creative energy. And I think that's not necessarily valued, and that's not necessarily going to make you a lot of money or make you famous. But for me, it made me happy.
Alex.
Yeah, I think, well, if you think about our history here, we had an intact education system for over 150,000 years or so. And it's just actually a blink of the eye where it changed. And that change has been very dramatic and traumatic. So I think, though, we're at a point now where we are, when I say we, not just Indigenous people, everybody is, has to, it's an imperative, validate and acknowledge Indigenous knowledge systems. So in order to do that, it's connected to land. And a lot of the policies in the colonization era and today were very much to do with the severing of land and land knowledge. And so the term for that is epistemicide. So the severing, the deliberate severing of knowledge systems, and all of that is land-based. So I teach in the College of Education at the U of S, so I'm working with pre-service teachers, but also people doing their graduate degrees in education who are teachers already. And the program or the area of focus that I have is land-based education. So I'm very much, I very much see that as a priority. And the way that land-based programming came about was a need from the community that was stated by the elders. And they said, you know, this mainstream education isn't working. It isn't working for anybody, really, because look at the mess it's got us in as a planet. So they said, can we have a system from our own paradigm, from our own worldview? And in our region, it's Cree, and I live and work in my traditional territory. And so we developed a land-based program based on that. And the understanding is that the land is the primary text, and that people need to become land literate, because that land literacy has been intentionally severed. So that's one of the things that I'm passionate about. And in our region, very similar to what Leanne was saying, my parents lived off the grid. They didn't have running water, you know, so they lived a sustainable lifestyle. That would be the terminology today. But yet in one generation, things have changed dramatically. So the hopeful part of it is, for us, it's only been that one generation. So we still have that knowledge there. We still have the language, and even when the language isn't spoken, you know how they say 80% of language is non-spoken? Well, that part is still with us, so meaning that it's still in our bodies. So it's within our reach, and again, an imperative for the urgent situation that we're in right now with the planet.
I want to spend some time, I have to say, I met Alex, I met all of them for the first time face-to-face only this morning, which often happens here in Stratford, but from that initial contact with each of these people, I think we could spend hours and hours and hours expanding on various things. And I want to talk about something Alex introduced me to this morning, and I would certainly invite the other panelists to join in as well here, on a project that you're working on that in some ways I think encapsulates exactly your connection with the land, your connection with sustainability, and your connection with dealing with problems that have been not necessarily problems that you've invented yourselves. They've been foisted upon you by another culture. But tell the people about this project that you're working on.
Well, I don't know more about 3 years ago. People know about the housing crisis in First Nations, and in my own community, we're no different. We have 57 band members, and 3,200 live in the community. And out of those 3,200 band members, we have a housing shortage of over 700 homes. And that's not just one person per home, meaning that 700 families don't have a house. And the irony of that, living in the boreal forest, in the trees and not having a home it's criminal. So we were trying to address that in Idle No More by making people aware of this and pressuring the government to live up to its treaty rights and responsibilities, but also taking action on it. So we did an educational campaign, but also thought, well, why don't we build a house? Like, of course, none of us were house builders, so we had no idea what we were doing. But we put the call out and said, well, come on, let's build a house. How hard can it be? And over 300 people helped out and built a house for a family in Big River First Nation. We built a tiny home, and in the process learned a lot, not just about building houses, but about how it all fits into the bigger picture. And from there, we realized that, you know, this is not a housing problem. Like, we already knew that, but like, this is a systemic problem around racism, environmental racism, misogyny, all those things impact housing. And so we decided that, well, why don't we go a bit further and try and do something like a sustainable village. And so we started the One House Many Nations OCN Sustainable Village project in my home community because we were invited to do it there. And so we had design workshops with elders and community members where we had architects and others with us come into our community and designed what we thought would be something that would work as a sustainable village. And from there, we developed a prototype, and in the process, we're recognized for this innovative design. It's based on ancient ideas, really. So it's going to be highlighted at the Edit 2017 show that starts in Toronto this week. And so we built the different modules, and then we backhauled them to Toronto, and they'll be here. So if any of you are interested, you can check it out. And then it'll be backhauled back to OCN, and a couple will start living in it in October. And then over the winter, they'll monitor what works, what doesn't work, and then from there, we'll put that into the next iteration of it, into the community.
And from there into other larger
Yeah.
One Hopes examples all the time.
Yeah.
These are the kind of projects, I assume, Leanne, that everybody knows about in the Indigenous community?
I think these are the kind of projects that there's a lot of people actively engaged in, and sort of, I think it's important to recognize that sort of work because it often doesn't make it into the mainstream media, and it doesn't make it into the TV sets of Canadians. But there's been so much work that have been done by Indigenous women and queer folks in terms of just ensuring our families' physical survival, taking care of our emotional needs, making sure our kids can know our stories and our languages and our songs and our dances. And all of that work, I think, is really important and often unseen work that sort of gets manifest when we get together into building homes for our community. So I think that's a really beautiful part of our existence.
Yeah, I think I'd also like to add, you know, there's another project called the Tiny House Warriors, and it's a Secwepemc territory that are making these tiny houses to put on land where the Kinder Morgan pipeline is proposed to go. So they're reclaiming it's their own land. It's unceded territory. And so like they're building houses that people can live in, but they're also, you know, doing something to protect their land at the same time. And very rarely do any of these stories hit the mainstream media, you know, just as Leanne said. So I'm glad we have the opportunity to talk about them today.
Well, I hope we've dropped a little pebble into the pond right now, and that something will expand from that. And in fact, Alex and I had a conversation already this morning. This is such an amazing idea. I got goosebumps this morning, and I'm getting goosebumps again right now, imagining.
You're going to build a house, you said?
I certainly know who to ask if I'm going to do that. No, it's the kind of project that I find totally inspiring because it's a project that solves it's necessary. This is a totally essential problem. a solution to a problem that is everywhere and certainly most prevalent and obvious, I think, in indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast in this country. Housing is something that is substandard everywhere. We are in front of the United Nations every couple of years anyway for, first off, why haven't we signed that important piece of international legislation that every other country in the world has signed? And then two, why is water such a problem? Water in this country that is full of water, why is water an issue on where people live who have lived here longer than anyone else? These are scandals. These are obscenities. Jared.
Well, one thing that I was going to say that it made me think about with what Alex was describing and these projects which are so essential and that you described and that involve so many community members coming together, which is such a beautiful thing. And at the same time, I mean, like, we're not talking about romantic, feel-good, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we built a home for somebody in our community level of problems. We're talking about, like, I think that to me is something that I find so frustrating about that reality. Because, like, we're in a situation here where there are historical agreements that are supposed to be honored, that are supposed to have, provided some equity in the relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous people in this country. And as many of us know, not one of those treaties has been honored. I mean, these relationships that are supposed to have been built and maintained have not been maintained on the part of the Canadian state and settler society. And so indigenous people have a burden of having to come up with these innovative solutions for basic level of survival. And to not see that for the problem that it is, which sometimes when it does reach the media, as we're talking about, is framed in these kind of narratives of either, oh, the poor victimized Native people, or the sort of romantic solutions to these problems denies the reality of the historic relationships that have made this way. This is not something that just happened to work out this way for indigenous people. These were designed systems that have created this disparity. And as a result of that disparity continuing, we are faced with the challenges in our communities to have to come up with these kinds of solutions because they're not being rectified or addressed in a meaningful way by the state. And I think that that reality sometimes gets lost in service to the larger narrative around even something, and I don't want us to go too far down the rabbit hole of reconciliation, but it's worth mentioning in the context of a time when the national conversation is being oriented toward this idea that we have addressed the historical sad chapter in our history, or whatever you want to frame it as. And we are now in a place of meaningful resolution to historical problems. But if you look at the state of water in indigenous communities across the country, and if you look at the state of housing and many other of the metrics beside, these are persistent problems. And there are mechanisms, legal mechanisms in place that were designed to help balance those scales that have not been addressed. And so I think that I as much as I want to be unequivocal in my support for the kinds of work that Alex is talking about, which of course I am at the level of that work being done, it underscores the very problem that those solutions are being designed to address because of the fact of that design systemic inequity. And that is really what we're talking about. And I think that that's an unfortunate burden that our people have continued to bear, because that flows through so many other aspects of our lives, both at the level of having to get the word out about the fact that 700 of our families in our community don't have a place to live. Hey, Canada. And that conversation is a repeated one because these things are not being addressed. And so, yeah, it makes me feel uneasy for the fact of that reproduction and that perpetuation of that disparity, because we do have mechanisms to address that disparity.
Yeah. There's a pile of logs right by my community that we have to drive by every day pretty much. And we went and measured it, and it's 0.7 of a kilometer long. But those logs go to make wood chips that make bags for dog food and cement. So imagine that, driving by that, and that pile, and we measured the square linear footage and everything, that pile alone could solve the housing crisis in the prairie provinces for First Nations people.
but it makes bags for dog food.
Yeah.
Some questions now from the audience, and I'm throwing this one in because it's one I would not have asked myself for sure. And in fact, in some ways, I feel like it's already been answered, although without actually asking the question. The question is, you haven't talked about spirituality. Why?
Oh, I think we have. I think Elizabeth, in her land acknowledgement, invited those spirits in to help us have this conversation in a good way. And I think for me, it's in the room.
I think also there's often we get asked to talk about spirituality as Indigenous people. And we were joking earlier, we said, I wonder if anyone will ask for a spirit name. But you know, it is a part of everything. So that I think that energy was brought in.
Another question from the audience. How can we who are not Indigenous become more land-based, more grounded? Jared?
Do a little learning. Get out on the land. Learn about the trees that grow where you live. Learn about the land where you are. I mean, yeah.
Experience the land.
Yeah, and I say this. I mean, I don't know how many of you have participated in or been witness to or read about conversations similar to the one that we're having now. But I'll say this just because in the context in which we're talking about a question like that, for me at least, it's something that's front of mind, which is that Indigenous people talk a lot about land, and there's some ways that, and there are other words that kind of work this way. Community is another one. There's some other, spirituality for that matter, and sometimes it can make it feel like the land is this thing that like lives up somewhere over there. We have this relation to the land, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not, like, we're not talking about some abstraction. We're not talking about a metaphor. You know, when the Standing Rock thing around water, it's like they're not, water is life, is not it's not a metaphor. Like, we're talking about actual relationships. That's what I mean about get out and learn about the land where you live, because that's what we're talking about. It's not some other land elsewhere. And I'll just say this, a final kind of point, just because it made me think about it with the way the stage is set up somehow, and there's a little marking of a square here, which maybe is a trapdoor for a theater piece. I don't know.
We don't know what's down there.
We don't know what's down there. The land maybe is down there. And this actually was the story I was going to share. So there's an artist collective that I love, an Indigenous artist collective called Post Commodity. And they have a piece whose name I forget, that they installed first in a gallery in Australia. I think was the first place they mounted it, and they've now done it elsewhere. But the premise of the piece, without getting into the details of the artwork, but I'll just say this. The premise of the piece was they cut into the floor of the gallery a square right through the concrete floor of the gallery and removed it and sort of set up the concrete slab as a kind of monument and had the earth, the actual land underneath the gallery, not only visible, but then there's various other pieces that kind of went into it with acoustics and sonics and stories of the place, and they had gone through a lot of protocol around being able to do that. And part of it I thought was just it's such a simple piece, and yet so ingenious in the way that it lays bare the very constructions that we're talking about that prevent us from having a relationship with something that is very material and present and with us at all times. And so I feel like in that respect, in terms of this idea of renewing a relationship to the land, it can start in very obvious and very simple ways. It's right here with us.
How did it happen for each of you? I mean, presumably there was some point or some time when you suddenly, maybe you didn't change, maybe it was with you from the get-go, but I can think, as a boy, it mattered to me a lot to get out of where I was living, to go into a place where initially I thought no one was living, but boy, you're surrounded by creatures of all sizes and shapes, and they're very much there. When did the experience of knowing that, and this is an expression I know existed within Indigenous communities, my first job was actually working in an organization called CASNIP, Canadian Association in Support of the Native Peoples. Interesting colonial title even. But I was working at that time on an organization that was dealing with Treaty 9, which was having a big political reaffirmation at the time. And I actually had, and I wish I had now, a button that was made by the Treaty 9 people, which was "Our land, our people." I think there was a comma between the two, but the comma was merely grammatical. The concept is our land is our people is our land. There's a connection that is not, you can't break that connection. If you break it at your own cost. And I think, when did it happen for each of you? When did you suddenly come to I don't know, I guess the eureka moment when you suddenly realized, this is what it's about? Leanne, you talked about maybe happening when you went back to the land with elders who were teaching you things or revealing to you things you already knew. When you were a child, did you have that knowledge?
I don't think I have a eureka moment. I think I was born into it. And when I look at my children now, I think that they sort of are living in a very Anishinaabe world and are very comfortable in the bush and on the land, and I think that that's where they really shine, and I think that was really true for me as well. I think that in the city and in the classroom and in the theater, there's this an artificial sort of anxiety that I always feel, but when I'm outside and I'm with the land, it's something that's very. I think I was born into it. Now, I know that that's not true for all Indigenous people, because there's been so much violence in order to dispossess us of the land so that Canada can build its economy and its infrastructure. But I think for me, I can't pinpoint a light bulb moment. I can pinpoint kind of several traumatic sort of disconnects of being disconnected, but I think that I was born into that connection.
Alex?
I would say the same. Of course, just playing in the water, making rafts, pushing each other in, seeing how far you can go without getting a booter. All those things are about learning about the land, and hunting and trapping when I was a kid, and kind of instilled respect, I guess. But in terms of a aha moment or eureka moment, I don't think there was one, but just many points of grounding and groundedness in connection to land that allowed me to harbor or to continue with kind of a relationship with land that's built on love.
Jarrett?
Yeah, I would say it would be more of a moment, or not moment, but a series of incremental returns. So in returning to place, and each time, particularly being with people who are super knowledgeable about the land, and each time coming back and learning something else and realizing how vast the knowledge system is that's available to us through that connection, that in the microscopic or minuscule ways in which I've tried to file some of the things that I've been told over the years, how much there is to learn even from returning to the same place over and over again. So yeah, I wouldn't say that it's not a singular moment, but it's a kind of ongoing process of kind of revealing how much there is to know from what's available to us.
Another question, this is very specific. Can you recommend one book to someone who wants to begin their education on Indigenous experience in Canada? And this can be a fiction book or a non-fiction book. What would it be?
I'd recommend Leanne's.
Leanne's book.
Yeah, there's in the lobby. There's copies.
Get it signed, I bet.
So Leanne, what book would you recommend?
Well, my dad is white, and he's a history teacher, and we've had some interesting discussions over the years. And one of the books that I think got through to him was Thomas King's Inconvenient Indian. So he's often said, "Why can't you write like that?" So I think that that's a good entry point. That's a good book that is a good starting point. I think we have some incredible Indigenous writers in our community. We have a very diverse, a lot of diverse voices because we come from diverse nations and we come from all different experiences. So I think my hope is that that's sort of a gateway book into Indigenous writing. And my hope is that this is sort of like a gateway talk into having the Stratford Festival have more relationships with Indigenous curators, with Indigenous playwrights, with Indigenous actors, so that we can sort of present our stories on our own terms and forge a relationship with audiences that's meaningful and real.
I've been given the 5-minute signal, so we have about 5 minutes to go, and I'll choose one more question from the audience that I think each of you can have 5 years to discuss this if you want, but the question is, considering the complexity of issues discussed here today, please summarize your own political, social, communal vision for a functioning and purposeful future on Turtle Island.
Wait, what was the last one?
Your own vision for a purposeful future of Turtle Island. Who's first? Obviously, we don't need to have the definitive answer here. We can reconvene again next year on the same time, same spot, and come up with.
I sort of would answer, I would say that my life is the answer to that, and the way that I'm living my life and conducting myself, the way that I'm raising my children, the way that I'm interacting with my territory. And when I'm sitting on this stage with my two friends and colleagues, I would also see that in the way that they're living their lives. And so I think that, and Elizabeth as well. And so I think that despite sort of the situation that Indigenous people find themselves in, I think one of the things that makes me feel really proud is our ability to take the knowledge from our ancestors and from our elders and amplify it and animate it and put it at the center of our lives to start living a different reality in spite of the violence of colonialism.
Jarrett?
Yeah, I would say something similar to what Leanne said, which is that, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the last few years in particular, in part because of the urgency of the things that we've been talking about today, but one thing that's become, I think, has sort of settled in my body and in my spirit over the last number of years has been an understanding that there are kind of multiple versions of what my life will unfold to be. And one of those is my own often misguided idea of whatever the hell I think I'm supposed to be doing in this life. And the other is that life in reflection with the community and the elders who have provided so much knowledge and guidance for me and who like hold me to account. And those things are not often the same. And so one of the ways that I've taken to making decisions or to thinking about what that work is over time and what that vision is over time is to constantly be in dialogue with those people from my community and from outside, others that are in our wider community whose voices and experience and knowledge and so on that I respect, to not be doing this on my own, as it were, to not be making decisions presumptuously in a way that that might not be in accord with what the actual needs of our community are. And in particular, I say this from specific experience in relationship to elders and in a ceremonial context from my home territory, where there are specific things that are being asked of me. And so I might have this vision of I'm in Toronto and doing all this cool music stuff and whatever else, but that is on balance checked by these other relationships in a way that that ensures the kind of responsibility of those relationships are maintained and nurtured and grown over time. And so I take that responsibility very seriously, and I feel like that is also what determines a kind of a collective future, is that process of being in dialogue and being in a right relation with one another.
Alex?
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. It's sometimes we don't have that much control over our destiny because somebody says, you need to do this, or you should do this. So I think for myself, it is just keep going. I don't know what it's going to look like, but just keep going.
It's a good place to end, I think.
Thank you so much, Alex, Jarrett, and Leanne, and Elizabeth, for coming today and sharing with us and opening the gateway today. I think it's a great phrase, so thank you. And a very special thank you to Paul. This is my first season as part of the Forum team, and I've enjoyed every minute of working with you on these fantastic events. And a big thank you to Philip Coulter, who you don't see because he's hiding up in the booth, the producer of Ideas, for your hard work, passion for all things, and your wisdom. Thank you so much. I encourage you on the way out to visit our theatre store kiosk, where we do have Leanne's book on sale. And we also have the CBC Massey lectures in print format. If you're looking for inspiration from more great innovators and thinkers of our time, you need look no further.
Tom King's book is out there, by the way, too.
The forum continues into October with fantastic guests and opportunities to immerse yourself in our work. So please visit our website at stratfordfestival.ca or pick up one of our calendars in the lobby for more information. I'd like to thank our panelists, our live audience today, and to our audience around the globe for your continued support of the Stratford Festival Forum. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.